Good evening. Welcome to New Symposium. Civil Discourse in the Pursuit of Truth.
Many of you have been to these and they've heard my spiel before. Let me just run through a couple of things real quickly. I want to make a general point or two about the topic and then make an announcement, and then we'll get on to the discussion. The question of the built environment is obviously a question of economics. It is obviously a question of very, very clear empirical and material concerns, but it is not solely that. It is also questions about the kind of life that we want to have here in Wichita, and the kind of life that we think is appropriate to a city like Wichita, and the kind of life that we would like to see shared with others in our community and passed on to our children and our grandchildren. So please keep that in mind. And then one last announcement, having just mentioned having just mentioned the topic of children, I'm using my prerogative as moderator to sell some of my daughter's Girl Scout cookies. They're right up there. You're thinking to yourself, oh, but Russell, I've already bought Girl Scout cookies, and I'm here to say to you, yeah, but you haven't bought Kristen Fox's Girl Scout cookies. So anyway, John Todd is guarding it up there, and I appreciate him doing that, but it's on the honor system. So if you get peckish during the night, they're available for you up there. All right. Our first presenter is Dr. Chase Billingham. I'm glad to be able to call Chase a friend. We've interacted quite a bit over the years as we have a lot of overlapping interests. He is an assistant professor of sociology at Wichita State University with a variety of interests involving urban sociology, gentrification, economic development, and stratification in U.S. metropolitan areas. I would also say that Chase has done tremendous work in terms of researching the history of Wichita. If the pavilion at Knapsker Park survives the remaking of that park, it is almost entirely due to the work that Chase did in researching the history of that place and some of the spaces there. So, our first presenter, Chase Billingham.
I don't think I can live up to that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the New Symposium Society for hosting this event tonight. Thanks to John Todd for inviting me to participate. Thanks to my fellow panelists for running the gauntlet here with me. Thanks especially to Russell for doing the most important job, wrangling, coercing, challenging, telling me to shut up when it's necessary. Russell gave us very specific directions. You heard some of that beforehand about timing and everything, but also he wanted us to respond to at least two of the prompts that were in the flyers that you may have seen. That's going to be difficult for me because they mostly involve normative evaluations. There isn't really one definitively correct answer to any of them, and that makes me nervous. When I speak in public, I like to have data. I like to know what I'm saying is true, that I can demonstrate it with empirical evidence, and I don't put too much stock into my own opinion about these sorts of things, even if I can bring evidence to bear on demonstrating how I came to my opinion. I don't want to step on too many toes, and like most people, I'm terrified of being wrong about things. But it would be disingenuous to say that a social scientist's work doesn't involve taking a stand on big and controversial issues. We often like to claim that we're merely observers looking for just the facts. But of course, that isn't true any more than it's true for anyone else in any other profession. So what I'd like to do is start by laying out a few basic positions that I advocate when I'm thinking about questions like this, about how cities should be built, about what purposes cities should serve, about how cities should work. And maybe that can help us to get to some of the answers for the questions that were posed. Or maybe it can just tell me to burn a few minutes of my presentation before I have to face up to the fact that I don't actually have good answers to a lot of these questions. So a few principles. First, cities are diverse places that have a wide range of people, groups, organizations, institutions, businesses, and land uses within them. And these groups have different interests. And critically, they use the city in varying ways. For the vast majority of us, we organize our experience, we orient our experience of the city around our daily lives, our daily rounds, our daily needs. What's most important in this circumstance is our ability to have access to urban space, to be in the city, to have access to the resources that we need, to the people that we care about in as efficient, as convenient a manner as possible. The city is a place to live, to use, to experience. For some of us, though, we orient our experience of the city around our ability to profit from it. What is most important in that circumstance is the value of the land, how much of that land we own, what we can do with it to grow that value, how we can realize that incremental growth, and how the levers of city government can be worked to hasten that growth. And so the city in this circumstance is a place to make profit from. These two basic orientations toward the city, though not entirely, are often at cross purposes with one another. Okay, second principle. Much of the time, if not most of the time, contemporary cities get built and maintained in a way designed to complement the priorities of the second group rather than the priorities of the first group. That's especially true when it comes to developing housing, but it's also true regarding public infrastructure, public amenities, and civic space. Of course, that doesn't mean that basic public amenities, public goods aren't ever provided, just that they are often provided as a product of and largely to the degree that they are compatible with the escalation of land values or the operation of profitable enterprise. Third, and here's where some more normative evaluations kind of come into play here, that ordering of priorities, in my view, ought to be reversed. A city should exist primarily to promote the priorities of the first group, the enjoyment of shelter, transportation, recreation. Of course, that doesn't mean that the priorities of the second group would necessarily cease to be realized. The city can still be a source of profit, but those profits would be the residuals of developments oriented toward the satisfaction of the everyday uses of the city by the majority, not the reverse. So my general framework for thinking about urban priorities in the work that I do, to steal a phrase from the great geographer Neil Brenner, is cities for people, not profit, at least not primarily. Now that's pretty abstract, pretty vague. What does it mean in practice, and what does it mean for Wichita? It means, first, democratically, that everyone in this city has an equal right to be in this city, to exist in the city, to use the city, and that universal right ought to be taken into consideration in any and every planning decision that gets made in the city. We should always keep in mind that most of the people who make most of the most important decisions in the city and any city, and most of the people who comment on those decisions, including most of us on the dais here today, are not representative fully of the population of the city. Most people are not civically active. But in general, those who are the least active are those who are the most directly affected by the actions of the public sector. They're the least able to shield themselves with their own resources from the actions of the public sector, and they're the most reliant themselves upon the public sector. They are less likely to participate in civic debates. They're probably less likely to be here tonight. But their lives and their needs need to be prioritized. Okay, so I've used up most of my time talking in generalities about where I begin when I'm thinking about some of these issues, but now to some of the specific questions that Russell asked, or that the society asked. What are the essential characteristics of Wichita's built environment? In my view, the essential characteristic of Wichita environmentally is isolation. Unlike some of the big metro areas like the Northeast Corridor from Boston to Washington, or the Great Lakes region stretching from Milwaukee to Buffalo, Wichita exists as an island of development, mostly surrounded by untouched land. We have no environmental barriers to expansion. We don't have much in the way of suburbs. And there's ample undeveloped land between Wichita and each of the suburbs that do exist. What that means is that compared to New York or San Francisco or even St. Louis or Kansas City, sprawl here is relatively easy and cheap. And so the next prompt, is Wichita overbuilt, underbuilt, or just right? In my view, it's certainly overbuilt. Among the 100 largest cities in the country, Wichita is right in the middle, about number 50 in terms of population. But it's in the bottom quarter in terms of density. As for the metro area, although the Wichita metro area is about 85th or so in terms of population, in terms of density, it's about number 260. There are well over 900 metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas that the U.S. Census Bureau keeps track of. By my count, out of those 900 plus metro and micro areas, there are only 6 that have a higher population than the Wichita area, but a lower density. What that means is that we are about as spread out as you can get. And there's reasons why that's problematic. For instance, it puts extra strain on city budgets to maintain and expand that infrastructure as the city grows further and further outward. And of course, there are significant environmental costs to that kind of sprawl. In terms of the principles that I laid out earlier, physical form is not necessarily related to a city's level of equity and accessibility. You can conceivably have a very dense, compact city that is very wealthy or very poor, very equitable or very inequitable. You can also have a very flat, sprawling city that's very wealthy or very poor, very equitable or very inequitable. In Wichita's case, I don't think it matters all that much because the city is small enough that even as sprawling as it is, it's still relatively easy to get from one end of it to another with relatively little inconvenience. Where it matters most is in terms of thinking about where new investment is happening, on the fringe or in the core. And the primary reason why the bulk of new development continues to happen in Wichita on the fringe, despite the fact that most of our discussions about development are about the core, is because it's still, in most cases, cheaper to build new on the fringe than it is to build amidst the existing built environment and infrastructure that exists in the core. Okay, final prompt that I'm going to address here. What is the best way our city should be built? Through public expense, private investment, or a combination of both? The obvious answer is both. That was an easy one. But I'll just say that a little bit. Urban development works differently today than it did 75 years ago or even 50 years ago. Government has always supported private development to a certain extent, but over the past several decades, the distinction between public and private has blurred considerably. Cities have taken an entrepreneurial turn, and city governments have increasingly assumed the responsibility of supporting private development through things like tax incentives, tax abatements, public-private partnerships, the use of mechanisms like tax increment financing. So it's a bit misleading to juxtapose public expense neatly against private investment. These days, public expense is used more than ever as a lure for private investment, and cities are often pitted against one another in a sort of zero-sum game of interurban competition. In my view, that's a strategy oriented primarily toward the prioritization of that first group that I was talking about, the city as a profit generator. What's been lost in the meantime is public spending, direct public spending, and the prioritization of the logic of urban space as a livable place used by regular people. And my preference would be to tilt the scales back in the other direction, but I will acknowledge that it's incredibly hard to do that if you're a mayor or a city manager. Whether you like incentives or not, city leaders' hands are often tied. You have to play the incentive game, or else you fear that you can lose out to more generous cities who are willing to play that game. And one city cannot unilaterally disarm. So what I would suggest what we need are more robust strategies for interurban cooperation rather than competition that can relax some of those imperatives for using incentives and allow cities to spend more of their money more directly on actually improving the lives directly of regular people. I'll stop there. Thank you. Is there any chance that we can get some water?
Can we get some water
Thank you.
somehow?
I don't mean to
Yeah,
be
that's
too much trouble.
that's what the dean is here for, to go get water.
Surprised Amy didn't jump.
Chase, I was really struck by a term that you used, the everyday uses of the majority. And the reason why that line jumped out at me is because it was quickly followed by, your no doubt extremely accurate observation that the sort of people that organize events like this, the sort of people who speak at events like this, are not particularly representative of the majority. In fact, you go on to say that the majority, almost by definition, is never particularly civically active. So here's my question for you. If the majority, whose everyday uses ideally a city will serve, are rarely civically active, how do civic leaders know what the everyday uses of the majority are?
Well, I think our elected officials do quite a good job of outreach to the local communities. We have a few city council members, or at least one city council member here. They have their own neighborhood, what do you call them? District advisory boards they meet regularly with, and they have their own outreach groups who provide that insight to them. But for instance, in the example of Wichita City Council, we have a very large city. We only have 6 city council members and 1 mayor. It's very hard, even with that type of outreach, for one city council member to be in touch with the voices of the members of that community. I mean, that's kind of what those district advisory boards are there to do, is to get more information from members of the community. But greater representation in terms of a larger body, a larger deliberative body for the city might be useful in terms of being able to reach more people.
Okay. I appreciate that perspective. I'm sure that that's something that's going to come up again. All right, we're going to move on to our next presenter, Mary Beth Jarvis, who is president and CEO of Wichita Festivals, Inc., and has had a very busy day today, as many of you are aware, again, kind of reflecting the fact that events like this tend to be kind of self-selecting in terms of civic engagement. Mary Beth Jarvis has served as the chairwoman of the Century 2 Advisory Committee, and they made their final report to the City Council just this morning, and I'm sure at least some element of that is going to be woven into your comments here. So let's all welcome Mary Beth Jarvis.
I'm feeling all special because the word breaking news was involved, and so I got to live up to that. I've got an odd background, and judging by the percentage of what Shay said I didn't understand, that it's not nearly as academic as many in the room, but I will do my best to keep up and I'll start out with a few thoughts just on my background and the different paths of my adult existence that have sort of led me to the dual roles previously mentioned. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in a combination of cities, primarily Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I then went off to university at Christian University up in Indiana, the University of Notre Dame. The single biggest example of low population giant sprawl, but it's a beautiful dang campus, let me tell you. That was a wonderful experience, and I was grateful to our United States Air Force for aiding my attendance at that fine institution. And so as a young officer, I owed the military about 4 years, did about 7. So I came to Wichita, Kansas as Captain Jarvis. And my last couple of years on active duty were spent at McConnell Air Force Base. And my husband and I, we were both military, were sure that we were moving here for a couple of years and then we'd head back east where we belonged. And 24 years later, we find ourselves as grateful as we can be for what all this community has provided us and our family in terms of opportunity and environment to grow and flourish. I finished up my last day on active duty military was a Friday, and my first day out at Koch Industries was a Monday. And I acquired an entirely new wardrobe during the course of that weekend. No more combat boots and polyester. And I then spent 15 years out at Koch Industries in a variety of roles, primarily working either internationally or elsewhere around the U.S. In public government affairs, culture building, a lot of our mergers and acquisitions. I had the privilege, though, during my time at Koch to be able to dive into community endeavors, mostly as a hobby. I'm a nerd volunteer for things like the Wichita YMCA and other institutions, but also on behalf of Koch was a representative on the Chamber of Commerce Board and got civically involved as a sidelight. Because it was part of my job, I could explain to my husband and kids that I just had to do all this volunteer stuff. And then 15 years into my time at Koch, I found a leap opportunity after a bit of a break to do this community stuff full time, and the opportunity to lead Wichita Festivals, which is a combination of civic engagement and community unity and building of pride and connectedness in this city that we had come to love. But it's also total logistics nerddom, and I have enjoyed helping that fine institution with its work in organizing Riverfest, in Autumn and Art at Bradley Fair, and celebrating our new airport a couple years ago, other events that we've been involved in. That's been a labor of love for the last 6 years. And the last year, I've had the labor of love of working with 11 amazing individuals, a couple of which are here tonight. Was proud to serve alongside them as the Citizens Advisory Committee, trying to analyze the next best move for Wichita at this juncture in its history, to look forward to what we should do with our performing arts organizations and the 50-year-old facility in which they have been living for some time. I will give you the very short version. There may be some of you that heard or read a bit about our recommendation. We've taken a look at the opportunities before us and the options for either remodeling, century to fit modern performing arts capabilities, which it has not been able to sustain for some time now, or building a new performing arts facility with the goal of serving our excellent performing arts organizations and our community and its arts and culture life into the future. Our recommendation to the city today was to build a new performing arts center. We believe that's a bold choice, and frankly, in our engagement with the community, it was exactly boldness. It was distinctive effort. It was signature transformation that incited passion. I think the comments about the built environment being very practical, very material, very ledger populating, but also having, particularly when you talk about it in the macro for a community, having an emotional component, having an engagement component, having a service component. We separated, or the city separated our committee's work in analyzing the future of performing arts and what's the rest answer there from a separate but equally important analysis of what this city should do going forward on conventions. And I think the separation of those things, though they are sort of intermingled in facilities to date and have been, is useful for two reasons. First of all, we've got a built environment that is ill-suited for the sharing of those as the convention industry and the performing arts technology and expectations have changed, but also because the business case, the ROI, the industry numbers, the math on conventions is much more clear. And that business case and revenue streams that go along with it, transient guest taxes and conventioneer revenues, is different than the case for performing arts, which is fundamentally a community case, and it has more heart to it. There's math, and the economic impact of our performing arts is clear and well documented. But it's a great example, and maybe a microcosm of the broader discussion here tonight, is when should the calculator brain intermingle with the community goals heart. And after 15 years out at Koch Industries, I've got a few opinions on how one might gauge the everyday usage of the majority of public services, less by their words maybe and more by their actions, right? There's things that you can measure in terms of the vibrancy of city services, of city facilities, of a community's built life. But I can tell you, I respect so much the points of view and the discipline that I was exposed to out at Koch for so many years, and the approach to value creation, the reciprocity, the mutual benefit that results in profit, that creates growth and that adds value in a community for a business and for customers and for residents. But I also have a little bit of a Charles Koch meets Charlie Chandler view that when it comes to a community, those who can be closest to their elected officials, those that can monitor the activities of the public sector with vigilance and with dialogue, communities can decide things for themselves and set a direction and vote with their resources and their voices to do something together as a community. So that answer about private sector, public sector, clearly we need the private sector taking risk. We need the built environment to have people behind it that are brave and have skin in the game. But we also need the public sector with the resources that it has and the responsibilities it has to sometimes get a message from communities that they want to do something that a community has passion for, and that can be visionary and that can be great and that can be pride-worthy and transformative. So you get the built environment meeting the engaged community that has a combination of resources and heart. And in between the two of those, I think you get a sense of culture and a vibrancy that reflects itself in private sector activity in addition to the public sector. So that's my brief summation of our breaking news, but also my foray into this, what I expect to be an incredibly powerful discussion. I love that it starts with the idea that humility allows for complexity, and that the ability to disagree with civility is one of our communities, our nation's most valued, our world's most valuable resource. And I'm just delighted to be a part of the dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you. I was really struck by the way you picked up and elaborated implicitly on themes that Chase talked about the way in which the public and the private, the way in which the profit side, the math side, interpenetrates with and is mutually shaped by also the emotional side. There was one element, though, that really stuck out to me in your comments, and that was when you talked about the engagement component. And maybe in some ways I'm going to throw at you the same question that I threw at Chase, but let me try to formulate it a little bit differently. You've just finished a long process of engagement. One of the most constant refrains that anybody who pays attention to these issues in Wichita hears is that decisions are being made without sufficient engagement. Decisions are being made without opportunity for input, without opportunity for dissent. How do you look on the last 12 months and see successes in engagement, and maybe also some ways that if you could do it all over again, maybe engagement could have been better achieved?
Well, I'll look backwards a little, but I also want to look forward, because using this specific process as an example, we are at, some midstream point. There are still incredibly important points of engagement with the community and frankly, decision-making by the community as a whole that we haven't gotten to yet. I would say this, though, as an initial parameter. I think that sometimes when you hear decisions were made without enough opportunity for dissent or engagement, often those are uttered by folks who don't necessarily agree with the decision that was made. So I think there is a difference between unanimity and a process that legitimately listened to differing points of view. We had the opportunity, using this particular process as an example, we had the privilege to be out in front of thousands of our community members in groups of 20 and 30 at district advisory boards and groups of hundreds. Scary as crap, can I just tell you, stand up there in front of giant crowds of people. But, and we heard all sorts of input. And frankly, we heard it was very different than we were told to expect. Oh, everyone over a certain age will think this way, or folks that don't really come down much will feel this way. And frankly, we found thoughtful, engaged citizens of all stripes with, in many cases, very surprising and in all cases, thoughtful points of view. Now, whatever ends up getting done ain't gonna please everybody. And my hope is that folks look back and judge accurately that all of those points of view were listened to, but we've ultimately got to pick a direction that we think is an optimal benefit for the community and can be executed. And if there's not, for example, a financial way clear to achieving that thing that some percentage of the folks love, and it falls by the wayside, hopefully it won't be because the engagement wasn't legit or sincere, and that people weren't listening. I'll tell you from the perspective of Wichita festivals, and before the Wichita Eagle got rid of the opinion line, there is an art to listening to lots of people. You have to listen for trends. You have to listen dispassionately. You can't take personally the most sort of severe phrasing of a comment, but nor should you only focus on those comments you agree with. You have got to hear the drumbeat, even if you have to filter out a little anger or a little ignorance, on the way to doing it. So you've got to listen, and you've got to do that with a sincere, open mind and open heart, even if later somebody's going to go back and go, well, clearly you didn't listen because you did the thing I didn't want. So it is an effort for thin-skinned people, but with really good ears. Speaking of which, anyway, that's my point of view.
Yeah.
Bold. You've got to be bold.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And just looking around the room, I can tell that this is going to come up in the discussion portion because there are people who have points of view. But now, We're going to go on to our third speaker. Robert Layton has served as Wichita City Manager since his appointment in 2009, 10 years. And you won't remember this, but we met when you were on the job about 3 months. You came out to Westlink Neighborhood Association. You gave a presentation. I think I asked you an annoying question about bike paths.
That would be consistent with our history.
Yeah, probably so.
Yeah.
He oversees over 3,000 employees, a $600 million budget, and a $1.7 billion capital improvement program. We really appreciate him taking the time to be with us tonight, and he has a PowerPoint, so you know he's official. Let's all welcome Robert Layton.
So I thought it was important that, at least for my 8 to 10 minutes, that we all have the same definition of built environment. And it's a really simple one: places and spaces created or modified by man. That simple. And I want to go back to what Chase talked about in terms of calling Wichita an island, right? We're not, we're a population center to ourselves. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to describe the built environment of our island. And I want to not just describe it, but maybe celebrate it as well, because I'm going to talk about community character as it's reflected in our built environment, in our infrastructure, in our man-made. So let's talk about built environment in Wichita, right? Number one is our street system. We have a water system, above ground and below ground, but again, impact on all of our lives. And I did get the right one, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I did. Not the misspelled one. We have, again, this is part of our water system as well. Public buildings, private buildings, all part of our built environment. This is part of our stormwater detention system, our stormwater system. This is what we are in Wichita. Sidewalks, basic function transportation. Playgrounds, park space, open spaces. There's a golf course, which is also a neighborhood amenity. We have bike paths, we have walking paths. We have the dreaded bike lane. That alone, I'm sure, will get conversation to go on. We have splash pads. Oh, by the way, these are Pete Meitzner splash pads. Commissioner Meitzner is with us. I will say, though, another promoter is our council member, Brian Fry, as well. And we can talk about that for a while. We have swimming pools. We have tennis courts. So as you can guess, we have baseball parks. And Brian, we will have a better picture of this, I promise you. We have a soccer complex. We have public parking, surface as well as garages. We have public art, which really, in many ways, makes us different, but creates that special place and talks about Wichita and who we are. More examples of public art that exist in the community. One of my favorites, The Troll, if you've ever seen it. We have public buildings, Advanced Learning Library. These are our community centers and our rec centers that exist in the community. Again, all contributing to the fabric of who we are. We have subdivisions, pretty much any kind of residential experience that you want available in this community. We have bridges, which also combine at times with public art and other public facilities that we have that look at special design elements that make us unique. We have places where we live and play and work. Another view, another daytime view. So we'll just go back to that. There are a couple of comments. I have some random thoughts that I want to talk about. As I said, in my mind, who we are as a community is reflected in our spaces and what we produce. But there are some things, you expect as a city manager, I'm going to talk about public investment. But, I've been here long enough, I think to change my general thought process regarding public expenditures, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that we're spending private dollars that are given to us, right? A lot of what I showed you up there, that infrastructure was originally constructed privately. It was then passed on to us as the new owners. It's our responsibility to maintain it. But so much of what our public infrastructure looks like, what our built environment looks like, was determined by the market, was determined by the private sector. There are times that we get involved in planning and regulation that I think is built around protecting the community that you have all built, right? Zoning is a good example. A lot of folks get concerned about zoning, but when you think about it, it's to protect the private investment in this community. It's a matter of how land is to be used in a way that's compatible or consistent with the existing development. And, you know, we see that when we are moving in the wrong direction in terms of zoning decisions, we hear from neighborhoods, we hear from areas or parts of the community that say, you're missing the boat. When someone wants to construct a big box retailer adjacent to a residential development, we hear about that. We say that's not consistent with what we want in our community. And so, again, that's to me the reason we should be involved in that type of regulation. There's another piece of what we do that isn't always addressed in the built environment, but it's how we manage our infrastructure. And a lot of times it's oriented towards public safety, right? So it's as simple as the speed limits we have on our streets. It includes the capacities that we built into our streets and what's acceptable. You talk about density, but you talk about traffic movement. And it's how much traffic do you want to run through a residential area, a neighborhood? How do you want to get traffic to employment centers? Those are all things that we have to think about in terms of accommodating the public's wishes and how they want to live. I'm not going to take the full 3 minutes that are left. I think we have to be careful when we talk about building a community that we want to pass on to the next generation. And that's only in that, how do we define we, right? Too often when we get caught in the discussions, and I'm sure we'll have that discussion today, sometimes it becomes a subjective, really a single opinion about how we should develop. And I think when we have the less than civil discourse, it's because your values clash with mine, and I don't think about the community value as much as I do my own personal value system. And when you're in my job and you're working on community building, it has to be collective. And so we have to provide the kind of process that allows for all of those voices to be heard, consistent with the questions that were asked of the two previous panelists. I think we are just starting to understand not the power of social media, but the power of easier access and for people to be able to express their opinion. And that's how we hear from the majority. And I think Mary Beth made a really good point about not just listening to the select few or those that aren't calling you names, but instead looking not just for trends, but even for the outliers. We learn a lot from the outliers, or almost as much from the outliers. They weren't looking for a referendum on C2, and they have not represented that the thought that they have is the collective thought of the community. They have simply said, these are the voices we heard, we took that into account, and in some cases, those on the dissent have to be accommodated, and you'll need to hear these voices as well because they're important and strong in the community. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to share. Like I said, a little bit disjointed. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and again, I'm honored to be able to attend this, to be invited. One thing I didn't say is there was an early comment about how remarkable it is that John Todd can put a group like this together. I can speak for myself and probably the rest of the panelists. You usually say yes to John because you just want him to quit hounding you. And so it's like, yeah, it's like, thank you. You do know John. It's like, John, I'll do it, just please let me get to my job. So, anyway, those are my comments.
Thank you very much. Bob, like with the previous two presenters, I want to pick up on a phrase that you used. You finished right there talking about how it's very important to understand who the we are. Earlier in your presentation, when you were talking about the built environment and where much of that building comes from, you talked about how what we're looking at is private dollars that have been given to us. So I'd like to pick up on that and ask, who is the us? A lot of people would say that by us you mean the city government. Other people would say, well, by us that means the Wichita public. And that, of course, could take us back to Chase and talking about the everyday uses of the majority and so forth. Now, you connected that to some references to zoning and how that is an instrument by which sometimes the values of a particular segment of the us can be expressed. But obviously there must be more collective processes than that. What are some other ways that you have seen as a city manager for people to effectively, and maybe sometimes less effectively, try to take their piece of the us that you were talking about there?
Okay, so one of my joys is to pivot and not directly answer your question.
Very good political skill.
Yeah. But, first of all, I want to remind everybody, we are in a representative democracy, right? And so ultimately, us, when it comes to the public expenditures, will be those who have been elected to represent us and to make those decisions. And they're not easy decisions. So in many ways, all of us collectively are involved in that decision, whether it's the input you provide an elected official or ultimately what that final decision is. In terms of, I'm not sure at the last part of your question, Russell, if it's a matter of what have I seen in terms of making sure that the us is abroad, if that's where we're headed, a broader representation of the community besides the way it's interpreted by our elected officials. I think it goes back to making sure people have many opportunities to have their voices heard, and whether that is part of a formal public hearing process or whether that's a social media town hall that we've been doing more of those, where we'll have thousands of people that will engage on our budget, our operating budget, provide us guidance before it ever gets to the city council, and is there for a formal vote. Back in the old days, we would never get this many people even in a room to talk about the budget. When I can say, more than 2,000 people helped me put the budget together for the council's consideration, I think that says that we're more and more moving towards a more authentic engagement model where people do have an authentic voice.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
We're now going to turn to our last presenter, Bob Weeks. He writes the Voice of Liberty blog. He is a frequent public commentator. We've been on panels together many times, Bob and I. I consider him a friend. Out of any 100 public issues, we agree on probably 3 of them. So we get along real well. In any case, Bob Weeks, who is a wonderful city gadfly, we are glad that he can be here with us today.
Thank you, Russell, and members of the board of the new symposium. And I always do what John Todd tells me to do. That's just my philosophy there. One of the questions or topics was, what's the best way our city should be built? Through public expense, private investment, or a combination of the both, or the public-private partnership, we might say. And to provide an answer for that, I'd like to just contrast 2 situations in Wichita. One, which is kind of the water walk downtown, and then the waterfront on the far east side of Wichita at 13th and Webb Road. The water walk downtown has had about $41 million of taxpayer subsidy invested in it, and yet I think it's fair to say it languishes. Even the Wichita Eagle has editorialized that skepticism to date is richly deserved about Water Walk. That was in 2009. Since then, there has been some development, like the Fairfield Inn, but then development has been lost from there too, as the Gander Mountain store has closed. So if we contrast that with the waterfront at 13th and Webb Road, no public subsidy there. Matter of fact, you can go through city council agendas and find where, for example, the developers spent about $1.5 million building Waterfront Parkway, a street that winds through the development, and then deeded that over to the city. You need more sewers or traffic lights, those people had to pay for that as well. But it's there at the waterfront where we see first-class office buildings, small luxurious executive offices. We find nationally known restaurants like P.F. Chang's. The city's only Whole Foods market is at the waterfront. And if we look at more cultural matters besides the raw commercial aspects of things, the Warren Theaters, East and West Side, are very highly regarded, really groundbreaking theaters in their day, and very lightly subsidized. I believe the East Theater received no government subsidy, the West did a little bit, and those theaters thrived. Except the one theater that they built in downtown Wichita under a public-private partnership floundered, and the city had to issue a bailout, a low and no interest loan to bail that out. So where do we really find lots of stuff that people really like and people want to use? Well, it's in the private sector, I think, not what government wants to build for us. And part of this, I think, comes from the attitude of the planning profession. And I was really struck about this in 2010 when we were developing the plan for downtown Wichita. We had a Boston architectural or planning firm, Goody Clancy, was hired. And David Dixon, their principal, came and told us that pretty soon Wichitans will be able to enjoy the kind of social and cultural richness that is only found at the core of the city. So I wonder, the patrons of the Mark Arts Project at 13th and Rock Road, far away from the core of the city, I wonder how they feel about missing out on social and cultural richness. Or I wonder about Michael Garvey, who is now building and running the Wichita Center for the Performing Arts, even further away from the core on East Central. Not culturally rich? I beg to differ on that. And one presenter that Goody Clancy brought in said, outside of Manhattan and Chicago, the traditional family household generally looks for a single-family detached house with yard where they think their kids might play, and they never do. Now, you could just feel the disdain that these speakers had for the people of Wichita and the choices that people in Wichita make. They think that we should have done something different. And I contrast that with private sector developers. You know, usually we say, well, these private sector developers, they're greedy. They only want to make a profit. But in the private sector, these people know that the only way they can get people to give them money is to build for them what they want, not what some, I'm going to say, elite person from Boston thinks we should build. And moving on, we're told that this planning process is driven by data. So David Dixon of Goody Clancy presented something called the walk score, measurement of how walkability a neighborhood is. So the walk score for the block where the Eaton Hotel was very high. And they said there's a grocery store just a couple blocks away. And what they cited as a grocery store was the Pepsi Bottling Group office. It's not a grocery store, it's an office. So I brought that up to someone, and someone said, well, go back and look, it's been fixed. Walk score really is good data this time. So now the grocery store closest to the Eaton Hotel is Marketplace at 155 North Market, which is an office building. Just happens to be called Marketplace because it's on Market Street, no grocery store. Then I looked again in 2014 and they'd updated again. Now the grocery store is Ray Sales Company. Well, if you know that, that's a little charming store, but it's just a little tiny place. I don't think it's what we call a grocery store because even though it's been there for many years, the planners in Wichita say we need a grocery store downtown. Oh, and they also included the Hot Spot Detox Shop as an example of a grocery store in downtown Wichita. But That's all topped by something that our city planners really fouled up on, which is the claim of how many people work in downtown Wichita. You've heard 26,000 people. That's what the Wichita Downtown Development Corporation, now known as Downtown Wichita, has told us for many years. And there, in fact, is a set of Census Bureau data that says in zip code 67202, that's downtown Wichita basically, there are 26,000 workers there. But that data from the Census Bureau also tells us that we count people by where their home or headquarters office is, not where they actually go to work. As a result, there's one block in downtown Wichita that is home to 7,740 workers, believe it or not. You know, that's getting up close to how many people work at Spirit. But the problem is that block is where the Wichita School Administrative Center is, or was. They've since moved from there. The school district has thousands of employees, but only a handful, or maybe a couple hundred or something, actually work in that downtown building. The rest are scattered out through the city. And the same thing happened in the block where the city of Wichita City Hall is located. 3,000 or so some employees indicated there, but they don't all work there right there. So this is what really leads to skepticism. We're told that a second biggest economic development win in recent years is the retention of Cargill here in Wichita. That's about 700 to 800 jobs. In other words, 1/10 as what we're told worked in one block of downtown. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, if the people really believed and look at that data, didn't they look at that one block and say, my God, what company do all those people work for in that one block? Where do they park? How can we duplicate this in other parts of Wichita? But no, the planning people for downtown, they did not look at that as far as I know. And when I tried to ask who was responsible for this, it was just a finger pointing all over there. The chair of the executive board of downtown Wichita blamed it on Jeff Fleur. Jeff Fleur blamed it on the Center for Economic Development at Wichita State University. And Jeremy Hill there blamed it on someone who didn't work there anymore. So no one was really willing to take accountability for that type of mistake. They didn't apologize to us either. They just simply dropped the reference to that. So, are there better alternatives than those currently used to build and maintain our city? Yes. I think the private sector is where we find the really nice things. The private sector is we find accountability. The private sector is where we find people motivated by profit and scared to death of going bankrupt. And that is my idea, that the more we turn over to the private sector, the more that the private sector does rather than public sector, I think we shall be better off. Way back almost 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville noted that the measure of the success of a government is how much is done by the private sector and not the government. And I think that that's a lesson that we could take to heart in Wichita. Just to close, a couple of years ago, we learned from the community investment plans that Wichita had a great deal of deferred maintenance. $45 to $55 million a year Wichita needed, streets, sewers, water supply, and so forth like that. And the Wichita Eagle quoted Mayor Brewer saying, we put it off, yeah, but now we've got to catch up. Well, I'm thinking, so who do we hold accountable? Could we hold Mayor Brewer accountable? No. He thought he was qualified to be governor of the state. So in the private sector, we have accountability. Public sector, at least with elected officials, not so much. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you. Bob, the way I see it, your presentation has a common theme, and that was it was a theme about skepticism, you know, and but you voiced that skepticism in a couple of different ways, and I'm not sure those two ways of voicing it map on to each other particularly well. So, I mean, you start out, you know, talking about the water walk development and talking about the relative effectiveness of private investment over some kind of city planning. Then you started giving a lot of examples, also very good ones, about bad data or data that's presented in ways that is rather disdainful of choices that people in Wichita are making. And one of your ways of talking about that was to emphasize the way that certain people who have studied the city, have bought into a particular conception of the importance of the downtown core. And you presented as a challenge to that the fact that we have the Wichita Performing Arts Center and we have Mark Arts that aren't part of that core. Are those private developments? Are those
Yes.
entirely, they are being done entirely without any kind of subsidies? They're being done entirely without any kind of city planning? Because it seems to me that if you're talking about skepticism that arises from the economic productivity of certain sorts of investments and a skepticism that arises from the way people approach or look at data, they're not necessarily talking about the same thing.
Well, as far as those two arts organizations, as far as I know, there was not city subsidy. As far as city planning, I presume that they had to fulfill zoning laws and comply with them, whatever they are. But, so I guess I'm not answering the question very thoroughly, am I? Russell, I'm sorry. It's...
Well, let's rephrase it. There's a way of being skeptical of the role of government that looks at economic outputs. And there's a way of being skeptical about the role of government when you look at the sources of information that it depends upon. In the latter case, you're looking solely at kind of the consequences of any particular act of building. In talking about the built environment. In the first case, or rather in the second case, you're talking instead about the kind of information that guides people when they think about where the built environment is going to occur or why it should occur in different ways. A study of the expressed interests or the perceived interests of the people, obviously you can fault that. You can find some reason to be skeptical of the kind of polling that goes into work there. That skepticism is of a different sort than a skepticism that says, well, we're just going to wait for the economic results. We're going to wait for the financial consequences of an investment. Or at least that's how it seems to me. Do you see them as essentially involving the same sort of skepticism, that there's a common theme there?
Well, I don't know about that. I think that markets have a wonderful mechanism for communicating information about what people value in different proportions, and that is the price mechanism. Chase mentioned earlier that development in the greenfield areas on the edge of town is less expensive than brownfield or filling in core areas. And a lot of our subsidy programs seek to correct that balance, but still we have some rather startling examples like the Water Walk where that hasn't been able to overcome people's expressed preferences.
Okay. I appreciate that, because the way I was listening to what you were saying, I felt like that there was a shift in the way that you were looking at skepticism. But I guess in your view, kind of the price mechanism serves as a bridging component within those two different forms of thinking.
When people actually spend money and do things, that's what they really want, rather than you hear us, like there's an RBL article about Joyland, and people say, oh, the city should build Joyland and do all this type of stuff. They're making wishes without really thinking about the cost of that, and would I really go to Joyland if we did have Joyland again?
Okay. I appreciate the clarity. All right. We've had some great presentations. We've stretched it out a little bit longer than we would have liked to normally, but we still have over a half an hour for discussions. Now, the way we're going to work with this is I am going to just call upon people as they raise their hand and express an interest in asking a question. Once again, please ask a question or turn it into a question, and please direct it to someone on the panel or to multiple people on the panel if you so choose. We're going to try to keep the questions short, and that way we'll give time for answers. I'm going to allow people on the panel to respond to the answers different people give to different questions, but we're also going to move it along so that we have as much opportunity to hear from you all here. And to start out, oh my word, we have Jane Jacobs in the audience with us today. One of the pioneers of urban thought. Ms. Jacobs, what is, thank you for deigning us with your presence, absolutely. Do you have a question?
Yes. There is a question.
Okay.
The greatest the greatest economic problem facing America and Wichita is the dearth of new companies. There are lots of fancy startups in Silicon Valley, but they don't create the jobs. And the built environment is crucial to that. Buildings are crucial to that. You can get, in new buildings, you can get big companies, you can get established companies, Whole Foods, Cargill, but the vitality of the city comes from little companies and startups, and they're very fragile, which is why you find them in old buildings, in old construction. If we want a vital network, how are the things that you, the 4 panel members, have said can help us create that vitality, that diversity, and that life that makes real cities vital?
So this is to everyone on the panel?
Yes.
Who wants to take Ms. Jacobs' question first?
Well, I'll take a stab at it in that, Ms. Jacobs, I just read part of your book the other night, is correct that it is young firms as opposed to small business that is really the driver of economic growth. We talk about small business a lot, but it's really young firms, and we need to have a lot of young firms because most young firms don't survive, but a few do, and they go on and they become like a Garmin International, or they become some of the successes like Coleman or Pizza Hut or whatever that we've had in Wichita. But the companies are very fragile, so we need to keep the cost of government as low as possible in order to make it more likely that these companies will survive. And our economic development philosophy in Wichita, I'm afraid, is oriented at just the opposite. We subsidize the big companies, the Spirits, the Cargills and so forth, and give them various forms of cash. Where's the mayor? Cash? We do. We gave them cash and other things that other people have to pay for. There is the idea that when we invest $1 in Spirit Oil systems, that we're going to get $1.50 back or $1.75 back or something like that. But I'm more skeptical of that than a lot of people are. So keep the cost of government as low as possible. Let more companies thrive.
Any thoughts about that from elsewhere on the panel?
Bob.
Well, okay.
So I understand Bob's concern about the cost of government, and that's what I'm paid to think about daily in terms of delivering services. A soft answer to your question is we have to provide what do I want to say, an amenity package. We have to have a kind of community that people want to live in and where they want to stay, right? And so some of that comes to the built environment, some of it comes to our labor force and the other amenities that people want in the community. But I think when it comes specifically to small business and new businesses, you know, Bob's onto something a little in terms of trying to get out of the way and making it a welcoming environment. One of the things that we're spending a lot of time talking about now is what can we do to kind of have a single point in City Hall where someone can say, what do I have to do to what are the permits I need, what other kinds of regulatory issues are involved in my startup. We're trying to identify those and eliminate or streamline as much as we can. And where there are necessities for regulation, we want to be able to make it easy for people to understand, make it easy entry. And I think we have to continue to work in that direction. And we can't do it alone because it's not my perspective that's important, it's their perspective. So the Chung report, which comes out every few weeks, talking about community issues, one of a piece about 2 months ago was talking about how difficult it is for small businesses to understand what the regulatory climate is, and they're lost, and they get frustrated, and frankly, if their capital is mobile, they like to actually leave the community to someplace that's deemed to be more friendly. But we took that to heart, and so we're reaching out to the people that were quoted in that article saying it was hard for us to get started, and we've actually mapped out the process and are looking at ways to address their pinch points.
I'm going to break my own rules, and I'm going to pick up on Ms. Jacobs' question, and I'm going to refine it here a little bit. Bob Layton and Bob Weeks have talked about the regulatory burden on businesses. You've talked about increasing efficiencies. You've talked about ways in which you can create amenities and opportunities. But the specific thing that she mentioned was old buildings so that rents are not as high. And this is about the built environment. How might that kind of focusing of the question maybe lead to a different response? Anyone on the panel?
Go ahead, Jason.
The neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs was writing about in the 1950s and 1960s, the neighborhoods that she was celebrating the most were neighborhoods like Greenwich Village in New York, the North End in Boston, West Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. These were deemed slums at the time. They were low-income neighborhoods. Today, they are some of the most heavily gentrified areas of those cities. I certainly can't afford to live in Greenwich Village today. I could have in the 1960 Greenwich Village that Jane Jacobs was writing about. These were working class areas, and the stores that she celebrated were small mom and pop shops that were corner stores that were patronized by the mostly working class residents of those areas. The neighborhood, what Jane Jacobs was writing in the 1960s, 1950s, and 1960s was often seen as iconoclastic. She was seen as sort of a rebel. Today, her views are mostly adopted by most planners these days. They're pretty popular these days. And Bob Weeks mentioned the Project Downtown plan for downtown Wichita, for instance. A lot of the elements that Jane Jacobs celebrates, things like storefronts that open right onto a sidewalk, low height buildings, and that type of older environment, that type of neighborhood feel. These are ideas that really got pioneered a lot by Jane Jacobs. And they are things that people try to recreate in the built environment in newer districts that people are trying to elevate and try to make hip. And so in Wichita, that would be the Old Town area, for instance. But what hasn't been reproduced in the same time point is the social class character of those neighborhoods. And so oftentimes we build neighborhoods that we want to resemble physically the neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs was writing about, the Greenwich Village of the mid-20th century, but at price points that are way out of line with what that neighborhood actually was when she was writing about it. So for instance, in the apartments that are being built in downtown Wichita today, a lot of the loft apartments, most of them are luxury apartments, and they are, in general, not filling all that rapidly. The prices are pretty high for the Wichita market in general. What we don't have in downtown Wichita is low-income housing. What we don't have in downtown Wichita is a lot of affordable housing. We have a lot of new apartments being built for upper-income people, and the demand shows, at least up to now, that demand is pretty soft. This is a place where the issue of the public sector and the private sector comes into play again, because the private sector, of course, that profit motive is very important. It's important that you can realize a return on your investment there. And that's in the past where the public sector has stepped in to provide affordable housing in places where the market isn't going to support that. The reason oftentimes why stores in downtown Wichita or in those neighborhoods aren't thriving as much is because there isn't a customer base. There aren't a lot of shoppers there. That's the reason why we don't have a grocery store in downtown Wichita. The way that you get that to be built is to have people down there, living down there, that are going to be shopping at those stores. The market seems to be indicating that a lot of really wealthy people don't want to live downtown in huge numbers, large enough to support a grocery store or some of those other smaller stores. Perhaps we could look at public intervention to create new large numbers of affordable housing to populate that area.
So how do we...
Hold on.
Sorry, go on there.
No, I'll go a minute and let you jump back in. I actually am going to express a blend of Bob and Bob's thoughts, but I think Chase has got some, focusing specifically on the question about young businesses. They're fragile, they're hungry, they're adaptive, they're scrambling. I actually think, my personal opinion, the role of simplifying the barriers that are sometimes put up by government, cost is a piece of it, but procedural is so much more of it. So many friends that have started or embarked on businesses have found that, the tax bill, we can all cry about that, but the illogic and the noise of trying to break through the barriers to run a small business if you're not already a lawyer, an accountant, paper pusher by trade. But I think the idea that the government should play an active role in preserving or creating spaces for those businesses to grow or thrive is perhaps a bit of hubris. I was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and Berlin has maybe the world's greatest collection of WeWork, right? Collective, workspaces, these sexy spaces where small businesses can come in and have a desk or a cubicle or a hipster coffee or whatever it is. And the government of Germany built a bunch of them. But they languished and they didn't really fill up despite being at more than market rates for the space. And what did they find is that businesses were going where their customers were, and hungry small businesses were in basements and garages and ugly slots on strip malls next to the cat hospital, right? Because that's where they could get off the ground, and they were going to. So let's not plan that they should go here. You go here. Let them find that ugly space in the strip mall until they're ready to move to something different. Let them go in the basement until they're ready to add an employee and jump out. But I think the public sector's role can be to get out of their way as best they can in order to allow them to focus on their customer and grow their business with as little, at least round and round activity integrating with the public sector as possible. And I do see strides made there.
I have a question for the audience as well as the panelists. If we have areas that are low cost and people start to gravitate to our Greenwich Village, right? How do we keep from that neighborhood being gentrified? How do we keep that affordable short of something as onerous as rent control, right? Because that issue is facing us right now on Commerce Street. We have some of the original Commerce Street businesses who are saying, I don't think we can afford to stay here now because of what's happening with real estate prices, what's happening with their taxes as a result of that. I'm worried that we're going to see the same thing in Delano now with the successes there. What's the thought about a Wichita approach to that?
I think the market will take care of it. If they move out of Commerce or Delano, they'll find their next neighborhood.
So it's just, okay.
I mean,
So it's not, don't try to preserve that space.
What's the role of government?
Okay, hold on.
What is the role of government?
Dr.
What is the
Fox?
role of the
Yeah.
private sector?
Doctor,
Okay. Thanks. Rob.
so, and I want to be clear before I ask my question on your role. Are you the city manager combined with the city planner? Or are you the city manager and we should have a city planner?
Well, we do have city planner, I'm city manager.
Okay, second, I want to answer your question. So, people I find as I poll them in the workplace, and I'm a student, I've got 5 classes to finish here at the university, thanks Doc. So, from the micro and the macroeconomic standpoint, and Mary Beth, I've got several things for you. And I want to go back to your Carl Brewer comment, Bob. Cascade Media Group, Kansas City, Brock Booker. Most people come to Wichita, young people under 35, and this is, you can look this on Gallup poll, you can look this up. I know it's out there. CNN Money, it's affordable to live here. That's it. That's the main ticket to get to Wichita. We can make it in Wichita. So, how do we make that downtown, that reality to where young people want to come to there and afford it and be able to thrive, get a job? We found out during this shutdown that most people that they live paycheck to paycheck. Most people live paycheck to paycheck. So my question is, how does the city reflect what people are going through each and every day. And with Century 2, I want to get on Wichita.
Let's work on that one. First of all, is that to the whole panel or just to Mr. Layton?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Do you want to start that, or Bob, do you want to start
I think
that?
there was part of that. I think the premise of that question is that downtown is a more desirable place than
Correct.
the outskirts. I don't see the basis for that.
Cost.
Cost of what?
I guess you missed my whole comment. People move here to Wichita. I came because I'm a performer. I'm a classically trained singer. So Century 2 is very important to me and this university. And the cost that it costs to go here. And the cost of living to be able to stay economically here. Many people are going through that right now.
Wait, are you saying it's too high or too low, and is that
It
specific
needs to be
downtown?
more affordable. It needs to be
Here,
lower.
let's let them answer, Brock.
I think the
Hold on, let's let them answer, Brock.
The first point that you made is correct. Wichita is one of the most affordable metro areas in the country. And we also need to be clear about the fact that downtown Wichita, which by Wichita housing market standards seems like it has astronomical rents, is also relatively affordable compared to downtown areas of other cities around the country. The question that the city manager asked is a really important one that's related to that, which is, what do you do when you have an affordable area that generates high demand, in part because it is affordable? I mean, that's what is going on in the early movement in Old Town and the early movement in the Commerce Street District that becomes so popular that those costs tend to go up. I wouldn't immediately write off ideas like rent control, but if we're not going to pursue something like that, then there are ways to use the mechanisms that are already at the disposal of the city government, although limited in terms of things like providing housing choice vouchers for, or convincing landlords that exist downtown to accept housing choice vouchers at a greater rate, setting aside a certain proportion of apartments in new developments, or guaranteeing that those will be below market rate, or a certain percentage of AMI or something like that. There are mechanisms, there are public policy mechanisms that can be deployed in areas that are escalating in cost to try to preserve those on the residential side, and there are parallel mechanisms on the commercial side.
Okay. All right, excuse me, we're going to go on to someone else. Let's jump to a different topic. You, sir.
Okay. Going back to Chase's point early on, you seem to be making, at least to some degree, a polar between prioritizing planning, in a sense, for the purpose of profit, particularly business profit. And then there's also the idea of planning and prioritizing mass public in general. I'm wondering if sometimes if that profit versus general public isn't so much a question of a profit in of itself, but in a profit of whose profit. In the sense of, sometimes what is profitable for a business may be not profitable for the general public. To use an example brought here as far as the skepticism, I understand now that the waterfront road was built by the for profit and then deeded to the city. So the skeptical part of my mind goes, well, is that because they built a white elephant? We'll build this road cheap, and then we'll defer the maintenance costs to the public. So my part in that is, how do you balance when the profit of private business is in direct conflict with the profit of the city long term?
It's very difficult. The job of the city manager and the job of the city council is not easy. For some of the reasons that I was talking about earlier, because city finances have just changed over time. Cities are receiving a lot less in federal aid, which I think is a good starting point to think about how we fund things in the public sector and the private sector. Cities just have a lot less money to work with coming from higher levels of government. So by necessity, it's important to rely on private development. The ultimate issue, and this is where I think I would diverge with Bob Weeks a bit, is the idea that the market will ultimately sort things out. The fundamental debate, I think, between public and private development is one about equity. Yes, a private developer can build things that will serve demand of customers, but generally speaking, those customers who are going to be able to pay for that. And that's where the public sector really comes in. If we want to talk about Century 2, again, this is something that our current city leaders have inherited. Century 2 was a public project that was largely funded with urban renewal dollars. It was something that the city of Wichita took on as a public project, and now we have to deal with what we're going to do with it 50 years later. That's an unenviable task for the city to try to figure out how we're going to come up with hundreds of millions of dollars, either to rebuild it or to restore it or to build something new. But we own that property as the city, so it's up to the city to try to do something with that. In an alternative circumstance, if Bob is going on Bob Weeks's logic, if there's a demand, strong enough demand for Broadway shows and opera and ballet in Wichita, one would presume that a wealthy developer would step in with land available to provide that amenity. It doesn't seem like that's forthcoming anytime soon in Wichita, and so that's where the public sector is stepping in to provide that public resource.
Chase, you brought up Bob pretty explicitly there. So Bob, is there anything you want to say in response to Chase?
Well, I may have thought that it sounded like, for example, at the waterfront at 13th and Webb Road, that road was developed to low standards because there was a necessity to earn a profit. No, that road was built to high standards. It's a beautiful parkway running through there because they wanted to have a high-end development. But that's not always the case. Our friend John Todd here worked in Park City real estate for many years, buying up infill lots and building homes that were relatively modest because that's what he felt there was a market for, and was able to earn profits in that way. So the profit motive doesn't always mean that we build things for wealthy people. We have Walmart, for example, who seeks to sell to people of all sorts of incomes.
Okay. Other questions? Carl.
I've got a quick question for Mr. Layton. One of the challenges I had as a county commissioner was trying to define prices and value. And Century 2, depreciation. What is the value of Century 2 on the books right now, and is it depreciated each year when you do your annual financial report? And if so, what's the value on it?
To be honest with you, Carl, I don't know the book value. I'm going to say it's pretty low because, yes, we do depreciate, and given the number of years that facility has been around, I'm going to say it's been fully depreciated out. So I don't know but I can't tell you what the book value is. But we do, all of our assets are depreciated. That's the method of accounting that we use, and that's demanded on us by GASB. That's so that you can draw parallels between our books and private books, for instance, in terms of how we treat assets.
Okay. Mary, obviously the engagement process that you were a part of was not directly focused on Century 2 itself, but rather the performing arts piece. But the process that you've been part of obviously brought a lot of information to you relevant to the point that Carl was just asking. Do you have some thoughts about Century 2 itself as a structure that have come out of the process that you might be comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. I do think, again, there are steps to be done, and that was one of the main points of our discussion this morning. We are making a clear recommendation that we think the right future home for our performing arts organizations and our arts and culture life for Wichita is in a facility that built from new, right-sized, appropriate capabilities, and has the best shot of being supported in its conception by both the public sector and the private sector, and then can be operated reasonably going forward. Only then, and then there's that period of time where we need the existing facilities within Century 2, as fully depreciated as they might be, they're what we got. And so we need those to stay alive and to be maintained and operated until there is a new home for those organizations, or we will see them die, and the appetite for that around the community is nil. And so that gives us a period of time where we can thoughtfully assess the options for either the building itself it's ginormous, and what all could be housed in there. And we've gotten a ton of community feedback, some of it perhaps more thoughtful than others, but there's real gems of potential wisdom in there that we need to put some sharpened pencils to. At the same time, that property, that section of Wichita's front yard, which is publicly owned right now and has been, we believe that the community deserves a real shot at analyzing how that space might be not repurposed as a building, but repurposed as a community gathering space, and that a signature central park, a place that families and citizens of all ages, along with visitors, can engage in and interact with, and that can add value to the community. And then we think the community ought to get a chance to choose. Here's our best 5 ideas for using 400,000 square feet of space under this really cool blue round roof. And here's our best idea for using that territory. All right, community, what do you think is going to add the most value? And there's got to be economics to that. Operating that facility, even with the portion of it that is pretty robustly used these days, ain't cheap. And that problem will get worse, not better. So we've got to have realistic choices. So the engagement that'll really make sense is when the community has a chance to see those alternative visions and weigh in for how they think that community asset, which is fundamentally all of ours as citizens and taxpayers, should be utilized.
Okay.
Can I just comment on that briefly?
Brief.
In terms of how that affects the built environment, depreciation's been brought up a lot, and it's an old building, it's hard to maintain. But the built environment matters here because as the city grows and as the city sprawls out, it becomes harder and harder to fund projects in the core because we are so far, we are reaching out so far to build new roads, new stores, and maintain all of that infrastructure. So, over the last quarter century, as line items on the budget, things like the libraries, parks, public works, transit, these have fallen as a share of a proportion of expenditures of the city, and that includes maintenance. Now, and I don't like to get into kind of conspiratorial things about purposeful neglect of things, but it is true that we are capable of funding less maintenance over time as we extend ourselves further, and that's an issue of sprawl in the built environment.
Okay. Let's see, Jacob.
We've talked a lot about what citizens of Wichita think about development and stuff, which is good because those are the opinions that do matter the most. But should we put any focus on how to attract people or businesses to Wichita? Or do you think we can be a growing city so that we can compete with Kansas City or Oklahoma City? Or should we just focus on keeping the people and businesses we have here happy first?
Do you want to direct that towards anyone in particular?
Mr. Laner and you.
Okay.
Well, growth for growth's sake doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but growth in terms of bringing people in to fill jobs, jobs that are available today, that's important. And so in terms of young, new businesses thriving, expanding, and then the existing businesses, we still have to have a viable workforce. And so we get back to the issue of the built environment, what kind of community do those people want to come to, right? And what is our role? One of the things, if I can just for a second pivot, this whole issue of what government's role is, don't you think that's a dynamic question, and it changes over time? What people think was important when Water Walk was built, right? And how much money was invested by the city or what kind of package was put together to encourage Water Walk made sense to, a number of people at that time. In today's environment, I'm not sure that that investment would be supported by the community. C2 is the perfect example. Here we have something that's important to us from the built environment standpoint, but a little bit going to Carl's question, if you look at it just on a return on investment, the city will never get enough money to make that pay out. Now, if I look at the economic benefit to the private sector from the activity there, maybe that's a little different. But we as a community have to decide what's the role of government. How should I be narrow? And I think Bob advocates that. Or we could be broad as we've been in the past. But I think as we go through different periods of development and experiences in our community, we redefine what it is we want from government. So today I would say that making the built environment work for us so we can get more people to move here is probably one of the most important things we could do.
Someone else. Jane.
I hear that younger people are moving away from Wichita. They make less money than older people. Plenty of housing is directed toward high-income people, as you indicated. What we really need, especially to retain younger people, is better transportation. Plenty of them are not even driving, and affordable housing. I'm going to let you pick out who.
Make a question. Make it a question.
Oh, how can you get affordable housing?
My question.
Instead of expensive housing?
Directed to?
Hey, Bob.
Jane, I was going to hide from you. Well, that's a question. Again, how much do we get involved as a city or a county, and how much does the private sector? I do challenge.
That's the least question you should answer, I think. You're the last guy to answer that.
The challenge, I challenge those who say it is cheaper to build on our edges than it is, in the city, right? Because if you take the full cost of building that house out in the suburbs, so to speak, then you've got to factor in all the new infrastructure that goes to support that. We got existing infrastructure in the core. It does come down to a market decision, and that is convincing people that it's good to live down, or not even downtown, but in the core of the city, that it's safe, right? That they can that the value of their property will either maintain or increase. And so we play a lot of different roles in that, in terms of public safety, in terms of trying to find ways to work with our sister government across the street to try to make some lots available to private developers, private builders to be able to construct. I think that smart infill is probably one of the best answers we have for affordable housing.
Well, because
Go ahead.
transportation becomes an issue. If they buy someplace inexpensive in, Derby or Park City or someplace, they still have to get a long way away to wherever they work. Transportation needs people to locate in central areas, the core area.
Your comment?
Yeah, I joking aside, I do think the issue of individual housing is the question least apt to be effectively and appropriately answered by the government. That is the part of this that is most clearly driven by public sector investment and property owners, but also individual decisions. I mean, my brother got out of college and went from living in Boston to living in San Francisco, and he wanted to live in Boston and he wanted to live in San Francisco. So when he lived in Boston, he lived in a big old house that was crumbling and awesome with 9 guys. And when he went to San Francisco, his was the 3rd bedroom, otherwise known as the dining room, with a shower curtain covering the opening, because that's where he wanted to choose to live. He found an affordable solution for him within their private sector, housing market. So I think, we just downsized, right? We did the empty nest thing and bought the little tiny deal rather than our last house. And so I got my first examination of the housing market in Wichita in 12 years. And there's a ton of options. And that was at incredibly reasonable prices. We're paying for a 3-bedroom house the same thing I paid for a 1-bedroom apartment when I first graduated from college in downtown Pittsburgh. So I think folks can get imaginative, and government trying to game the system, I don't think is the solution. This is a housing market that can be driven by people's personal decisions in ways that I think are more powerful than orchestration. And boy, I'll tell you, I agree with Chase that compared to other markets, this is not the place where you check it off your I want to go there list because you can't make rent. There's configuration.
It's important to keep that in context,
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to insist that we have time for 2 more questions because I see 2 hands raised, and I suspect these questions will be radically different from each other. So, first of all, right there. Yeah.
Brent Davis. Since profits are key to citizen income and government taxes come from business profits. And private initiatives freely acquire these profits where public supported insurers that force by taking tax money from the citizens. When we take money from regional planning and different things like this, we take money from the citizens that they could be using to make new businesses and grow businesses and hire people. And so with this new project and other projects like this, how could we take more of a voluntary donation approach for businesses and people to voluntarily donate and maybe build the new idea piecemeal instead of trying to do something grandiose that might become a Century 2.
Is that mostly directed to Mary?
Bob, Mary, everybody.
Okay.
You go, Bob.
Well, I'm always cognizant that when we do decide to build something to taxation, that everybody has to pay for that. When probably the most likely source of taxation for a new Century 2 would be what we did for the new Intrust Bank Arena, which would be a sales tax. And Kansas is one of the very few states where everybody pays the full freight of sales tax on their groceries. So we have a situation where low-income families face a very disproportionate burden of taxation there on their food. And when you consider that, what happens at Century 2 as far as the symphony and the music theater and so forth is kind of highbrow entertainment that's kind of expensive, but yet we're asking everybody to pay for that, which by necessity takes away the money that they have to spend on their own preferred form of leisure.
Any other responses to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with Bob that sales tax is by its nature more regressive than one would like. There are other forms of taxation that are less regressive and that are more personal choice oriented. Property tax is a great example. The four of us across here could have the same income, but we could decide what kind of property we lived in and therefore what our tax burden would be. Those are choices that drive our tax burden. Income tax is even less regressive than sales tax. The problem is that those are not toggleable at the local level necessarily the same way sales tax is. We've actually consulted specifically, because we're not there. We're not ready to say, here's how we want the community to step up and pay for this, or even what it would pay for. But what we will probably need to get there. And so I would have 2 points of view. First, we want to try to construct something. We've actually asked my former colleagues and good friends out at Koch to help us come up with some formulas that might mitigate some of that regressiveness, that might mitigate the impact on lower income families from a tax like that. But beyond that, the idea that you can do something transformational for a community with passion and do it piecemeal have actually come in. We've seen those come exactly to a head with regard to this process. People will buy in if we are willing to have a bold vision, and if we are willing to walk away at the end of it with something that makes a dramatic difference. They are not willing to buy in if we are, we're going to meh it, or if we're going to drag it out so long that we don't end up realizing a solution in time to capitalize on that for the pride-worthy factor, the attraction of visitors, the improvement of the capabilities, and the timely manner.
Century 3.
Right, yeah, right. So,
well, hold on,
voluntarily, how could we get more of a voluntary?
and I think our vision is to combine a community voluntary, because right, if a community is going to buy into a public funding stream, they're going to do so with their votes and with their voices. But also, if we have that compelling vision, if we have that dramatic improvement for our community, we have seen real appetite in the philanthropic circles and in the private donation circles. There is no appetite in the private donation circles and the philanthropic circles for meh, or for a solution that's that's a series of settling. And so we've got to go dramatic if we want that voluntary support to be impactful and real. And that in and of itself would reduce the public burden. So we want to try to have our cake and eat it too here. And the only way to do that is to be bold.
Okay. We've gone past time, but I want to give our final question to my favorite Deleuzian radical, Zach.
Hey, thanks, Russell.
Absolutely. I'm going to duck now.
Yeah.
I'm going to look that up at the end of this. But,
It's not going to be as amazing as you think, but throughout the whole presentation, it's been really interesting, and thank you for being here. Chase set up what I think has become a misunderstood polarity at the beginning of his talk. And he talked about these two different functions of the city. One is the public use, the everyday use, and the other is the city for profit. This became a polarization of, is it government that makes decisions, or is it the private sector that makes decisions? And I think I can assume that Chase didn't mean it in that way, all the way. And even if he did, then he's wrong.
just to be clear.
Yeah. Because when I'm listening to this whole presentation, I hear public sector and I hear private sector, but there's only one logic. And it's always the logic of profit. And so we've never talked about any of that regular use throughout the whole presentation, because all of the regular use that may have been opposed to private sector use has always been still with private sector logic. The city must realize returns on investment, must do something to bring in businesses or to bring in new talent. The real, well, another way to rephrase what Chase has said in the beginning, his thing to me would be the opposition between economics and value. And what Chase is really suggesting, when I'm making Chase really suggest, is that we are not focusing on value or a way to detach value from economics. Because if I'm, there are all these different people in Wichita, I don't think a lot of them would understand what you're talking, not because they couldn't comprehend it, because none of what's been said here relates to their lives as they live it. The question, and so here's my question.
Here's the question.
Here's my question.
Right.
And I will phrase it, the question is just simply, how are you going to create value for people who live here who cannot leave? Because that's a group of people who, we can talk about bringing people in, how do we get people to come here? I want to know, how can you make living here tenable and survivable? Because for a lot of people it isn't. And I'll suggest that takes a significantly different logic than anything.
Via the built environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all, yeah.
All right, who wants to take it? I mean, Chase, you got to say something, but others can say something too.
Well, much of what we do in a traditional sense isn't driven by ROI, right?
Right.
In terms of just what I showed you on our infrastructure, if you want to talk about that as part of the built environment, including our recreational amenities, I don't do that calculation on any of our recreational amenities, which again talks about quality of life for those who are here and can't leave or choose not to leave, right? So it's not even about attraction in that regard. So I don't buy the premise that it's that everything that I've been talking about is driven by economics, because that's not all of what my business is about.
Well, if I'm allowed to detach myself completely from reality, massive reorientations in spending, massive reprioritizations of spending, and massive more amounts of money to be spent. That is what you would want from the government side. And then on the local community, individual people organize their own communities. Individual people organize with one another at their workplaces. Individual people create the built environment every single day in living their lives. And so there's both a top-down and a bottom-up approach to building a community. A lot of that would require a lot more money, and it's just not a discussion that is likely to be happening anytime soon.
And with that, we come to an end of this new symposium.